Good morning, Colorado brokers. Connie Tremblay, instructor here. Happy January. Hope you are getting some good moisture where you are and you're being safe. Wanted to talk about a couple of things this morning. The sellers filling out sellers property disclosures, the required adverse material facts disclosure, and wanted to let you know I do have some upcoming online classes that are either offered through an association or just through myself. And if they're offered through another association that you don't belong to, a lot of times you can still take those classes. You may have to take more or you may have to pay more than that association charges their members, but sometimes that's the most convenient for you. So if you're looking to take classes from me, click the link down below and hope to see you online. So sellers filling out sellers property disclosures. There's some misconceptions in the broker world around that. All sellers, almost, should be filling out sellers property disclosures. The fact that they live there or they've never lived there is irrelevant. Whether or not they live in Colorado or they've ever lived in Colorado, it's irrelevant. Because if you read the beginning sections of the seller's property disclosure, as well as what's in the contract to buy and sell, all the seller is giving, all the seller is disclosing is what they know, what they have direct knowledge regarding. Now, there are three different types of sections in the seller's property disclosure that was updated this year, 2023. There are things that have ever existed. Things that ever existed while they owned it, or they found out about that from previous sellers, ever existed, even if those items have been fixed. And of course, we hope they have. But even if those items have been fixed, if they've ever existed, they need to disclose that. There are things that are now existing. Whether or not they're an adverse material fact, and we're going to talk about that here in a second, there are different sections on the seller's property disclosure that specifically says, do any of these now exist? And then the 2023 seller's property disclosure also has some additional sections that the seller can provide information regarding quite a few different areas of their house, and information such as who's the electrical provider, who's the seller's internet provider. You're going to want to read through the seller's properties disclosure. And if you haven't done that yet, go ahead and read that. And the next thing that I want to make sure brokers are aware of is the seller's disclosure requirement of something called adverse material facts. Now, the Real Estate Commission was so kind as to give us a definition of this, because in 2019, the seller's disclosure requirement was elevated to this adverse material facts. Prior to the 2019 contract between the buyer and seller, the seller's only disclosure requirement was something called latent defects, and latent means hidden, on the property itself. Well, now that's been elevated to adverse material facts, and the Real Estate Commission's definition of adverse material facts is anything a reasonable person would ascribe or give enough significance to that it's contrary to their interest in a real estate transaction. I'm going to give you a couple of different examples. You may have already heard me share these in a class. Let's say you go to list a property with a seller, and as you're walking around the backyard, the next door neighbor's two little dogs come over to the fence and say hi. You pat them on the head, hello Fido and Fifi, and you move along. I wouldn't say Fido and Fifi are an adverse material fact. However, if that seller, that reasonable person, has already ascribed enough significance to Fido and Fifi, contrary to their interest in a transaction, for example, that seller calls you and says, I can't live here anymore. I have to sell my house because of Fido and Fifi. They are now an adverse material fact because that individual has ascribed enough significance to Fido and Fifi that they are an adverse material fact. And the seller is required per the contract to buy and sell to disclose any adverse material facts, whether or not they fill out a seller's property disclosure. And they, of course, have to disclose that in writing. So adverse material facts can be things that are on the property. It can be things outside the property. It could be the neighbors. It could be the neighborhood. It could be the access road. It could be things in the air or things underground. It could be things on title. It could be hazardous conditions. It's anything a reasonable person would ascribe enough significance to that they might say, I don't know if I want to buy that house because of that fact. So, seller's property disclosures, just to recap, sellers should be filling out seller's property disclosures regardless of whether they currently live there or they've ever lived there. And I can sometimes guess or assume when a broker has gotten involved with the seller and telling them to fill it out. When I get a seller's property disclosure back and the only thing that's on there is the water information. Because guys, there's a lot of other things that seller could fill out, such as, do you have 220? One last note before I let you guys go. Yes, you are not allowed to take a complete hands-off approach on this seller's property disclosure. Yes, you do have some responsibility. When you receive that SPD back from the seller, you should review it to make sure any adverse material facts that you know about as the broker are included on there. And if they're not, you need to send that back to the seller and say, hey, I think you forgot these items. And if that seller gives you any resistance, let them know that this is their first line of defense against future claims. Feel free to give them commission position 25 as well, the revised commission position statement. So talk to you guys soon. Have a great rest of your day.